Welcome to our bucket course of the day. It's so great to see everybody here in our new space here in the Weingart Civic Innovation Pavilion at Renfrow Hall. Excited to see everybody here today. I wanted to just quickly, those that are new maybe to the space, a reminder, first of all, we're not going to take a break during this time, but I want you to get up and get more refreshments over here. So we have our coffee and cookies over here to my left, your right. And then restrooms, there are two restrooms over here to my right that you can get up and use during this time too. So excited to have this new space. Please feel free to roam, get comfy. But I think there's a reason why there might be a lot of people here today, because we have nice weather. No, Michael, no. So I wanted, very, very excited today to welcome, before I start that, a couple things. A reminder, again, for this space, because I saw this sign. We do have a hearing loop in here, so if you need to turn that on your cell phone, please do that at this time. And then obviously, silence your cell phone so we can enjoy this program. And I don't have to remind anyone to help me put away tables and chairs because it just stays like this while we're here. So we don't have to do that. So my only reminders are hearing loop and cell phone silence. Okay, now let's move on to the topic today. So today we get the pleasure of hearing from Professor Michael Guenther. I love this. I'm so excited to hear about, he's going to talk about science and politics in the 1790s. I think this will be a fantastic topic. Mike, I'm so glad you're here today. Thank you so much for being here. Will you please help me welcome Professor Guenther?
Let's see.
Yeah.
That works? Okay, excellent. Yeah, thank you. I'm excited to be here too, and thank you all for coming out. Maybe I get to be first for the bucket series because I'm going chronologically in the oldest amount of time here. So I'm taking us back to the 1790s, a period when the federal constitution had just been passed, and Americans were trying to figure out what kind of government, what kind of institution, what kind of politics we would have amidst all the turmoil of the French Revolution. For which many Americans saw that as an extension of their own fight for liberty. There were emigres fleeing to America from Ireland, France, England itself, which was having all kinds of partisan politics that I'm going to talk about. So it was this really interesting moment of time that has echoes a lot in today's world, obviously. Or not obviously, the ways I'll talk about here. It's the end of a book project that I'm working on about science and politics during the age of revolutions. And I want to focus today on two really interesting moments that became huge controversies that kind of roiled. One I'll look at in America with this figure George Logan, who had this kind of controversial mission to France for politics. And I'll talk about why science is woven into these. And then the other, an earlier kind of episode in England. So let me take us back and kind of set a scene here. And I'll just try to describe images too for those that might not see them as well. But so fall 1798 is this moment where John Adams is the president. America is in an almost state of war with France. Partisan politics has heated up to levels that even eclipse our own partisan politics. And it's particularly disorienting for the founding generation that didn't think of parties as legitimate organizations. They would have thought of them as factions that were destroying the country. So Adams in 1798, I'm going to talk about why he ends up feeling that a lot of the political turmoil of this period is connected to science. And so in 1798, he has a series of letters with his Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, in the fall that I think are just really fascinating to look at and that have echoes today. So Adams had just helped sign into law, and the Congress had passed a series of alien and sedition acts. And so I have one of the images here is an act concerning aliens that was passed. There are two alien acts. There's an alien, what we call the Alien Friends Act, which allows the president to round up and deport anyone who's seen as subversive, anyone who is not a U.S. citizen, any alien from, quote, a friendly country. So anyone, basically. Then there's and that act is passed, and it's set to sunset as soon as his presidency ends. So this is going to create a lot of ill will, right? Like, give me these powers, but only I have these powers. They will cease to be powers when I leave office. And I'm going to talk about why scientists become the big focal point of rounding up aliens from quote-unquote friendly countries that we're not at war at. There's the Alien Enemies Act that is in the news today that's used to detain and arrest Venezuelans and other groups. That remained on the books. That says that the president can round up, arrest, detain, deport anyone from an alien country that we are at war with or in hostilities with. So that's a second act that also I'll mention a little bit. And then there's the sedition acts that make it illegal to publish or to write or to publish material that subverts the legitimacy of the government or calls it into question in scurrilous ways. So there's these kind of series of repressive laws that are clamping down on free speech and association. It's something I want to really talk about a lot today with networks and people moving around. But when you read the correspondence between Adams and Pickering, they're constantly talking about all of these threats coming from the world of science. So one of the first people they look to deport or detain under the Alien Friends Act is this General Victor Collot, who is a French naturalist. And I kind of almost want to use air quotes because there's so many expeditions that are going on in the 1790s that claim to be naturalist expeditions, but are really kind of diplomatic and political maneuvers. So Victor Collot has a team of French naturalists, and they're going all through the backcountry, down the Mississippi River, and they're seeming to scheme to plot to take this part of the West away from Spain, who had acquired it after the 7 Years' War. So one thing I want to just emphasize that we forget today, but all the western part would be the Louisiana Purchase, but even the parts east of the Mississippi that are technically part of America, they are just ripe with schemes to set up independent republics, to pull those away. It's like a power vacuum. They really don't think the Spanish should have it. And so the French, different Americans, this is what gets Aaron Burr eventually in big trouble. He leads a scheme to try to launch independence efforts out west. But anyway, Victor Collot, this scientific naturalist, is going around basically plotting with locals to kind of start a rebellion, make an independent republic, and align it with the French. The same thing had been done by a French botanist, Andrew Michaud. He had led an expedition a few years earlier. And so anyway, there's just this sense that they're sheep's and wolf's clothing. Don't trust these scientists that are moving around through the backcountry corresponding with people. So they're one of the first people that's going to be detained is Victor Collot. Behind Victor Collot is this French chemist, Pierre Auguste Adet, who is the French consul in America, but he's a disciple of Lavoisier, and he's sent by the French government in order to help pry apart the Western territories, but also to help line up all the Republicans, and by Republicans I mean the Democratic Republicans that follow Thomas Jefferson. There's a sense that they're pro-French and that they're upset with the Federalists, who they see as pro-English. And so Adet's job is to build alliances with them and to work with them to overthrow the Adams administration in the next election. And they send a chemist, a disciple of Lavoisier, to America because they know that the leader of the Republican Party is Thomas Jefferson, a famous scientist. Almost all of the leaders of the Democratic Republican Party in Philadelphia, which is our nation's capital, in 1790 are all at the American Philosophical Society. They tend to be all chemists, astronomers, kind of scientist. And so Adet is seen as, unlike Citizen Genet that you may have read about in high school textbooks, who came to America trying to recruit revolutionaries and who really upset Washington and was just not tactful. Citizen Adet is going to come over and use his scientific networks to mobilize people in particular ways. And then, so Pickering is we need to get Adet, we need to deport him, even though he's the consul general. And then he starts making a list. While we're at it, let's deport Joseph Priestley, the famous English chemist and radical and founder of Unitarianism. He's in this nest of vipers over at the American Philosophical Society with Adet, with Jefferson, with the astronomer David Rittenhouse, and so forth. He's got a friend, Thomas Cooper. Well, I'll talk about them a little bit more. Thomas Cooper's a radical chemist, Enlightenment, kind of deist, radical politician. So they're all on the list of people that he's going to round up and deport. And so the list of what this Alien Act is going to be used at is less actually just straight up political opposition and more an attempt to clear out, again, this kind of web of international agitators that are seen moving way too freely and using their scientific connections to travel through England, France, America. And people today that we don't remember as scientists, I'll use the example of someone like Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine spent most of his life traveling around the Atlantic world as an engineer and bridge builder. That's why he comes to America in the 1770s. That's why he goes to England later. That's why he goes to France through the Academy of Science. So they're using these kind of networks of science to engage in politics. And I was mentioning there's this moment going on where Adams just feels besieged by all this kind of scientific activity. And then he, to top it off, and what I'm going to talk about more today, is in 1798, the summer of it, he discovers that George Logan, who is kind of the protege of Benjamin Franklin, kind of one of America's most well-connected scientists, that he has slipped off in the middle of the summer to go to Europe to negotiate with the French, to try to end the growing hostilities. I've got some images here for the, there was this XYZ affair, this moment where the French Republic demanded that American ambassadors pay bribes to be able to be seated at court. And the Adams administration was appalled by that. Their campaign slogan in the election was "Millions for our defense, not a cent for tribute." And so this became this burning political issue, like America has no diplomatic corps over in France. Adams ends up nullifying all the treaties with France. It just looks like America is about to go to war with France. And so George Logan, the scientist, slips away on a kind of secret mission over to France. And when he comes back, there's a kind of a firestorm of political controversy that I'll talk about. So anyway, I wanted to read a passage in these letters. So all of this is happening in the fall of 1798, and then Pickering says to John Adams, guess what? The French Republic just wrote us a letter. They'd like to send a team of scientists to set up an academy in America to help build ties between these sister republics. And this letter, I think, is really revealing, so I'll read it to everyone in the room. Adams says, "I shall not be guilty of so much affection or regard to science as to be very willing to grant passports to DuPont du Nemours." And DuPont, that name might ring bells. This is the family that would create the DuPont Chemical Corporation. Another example of chemists, politicians, whatnot. In fact, he tells Pickering, arrest DuPont as soon as he arrives in America, arrest him and deport him. Or any other French philosophers, and by philosophers you mean scientists, in the present situation of our country. I really begin to think, or rather to suspect, that learned academies, not under the immediate inspection and control of government, have disorganized the world and are incompatible with social order here. So Adams has finally kind of had it with these webs of kind of political intrigue emanating from science. And I'll just show quickly a kind of cartoon. There's many of them that exist, especially the British have a wonderful culture of cartooning in the 1790s as the public is following along in politics. And this one shows some of the stock stereotypes of scientists in their cabinet of curiosities. This one portrayed as an alchemist blowing the bellows. But I can't underscore enough the connection between radical chemistry and radical politics during the 1790s. Everyone understood it as a connection. Maybe similar to today when people see a connection between universities and kind of radical politics, that that it has that deep association for people that we'll talk about. So let me come to George Logan, this figure I mentioned, because he'll be one of the main things I kind of discuss with you today and share the research I've been doing. Logan is successful, very surprisingly. In fact, let me read a quote from George Washington. So Logan comes back after being gone for 4 months, and the Federalists were desperate to know what he was doing. They sent spies on his tails. All the consulates in Europe were trying to send people, and so we actually know what he was doing because people are reporting back who he's meeting with, how he's moving through France. He comes back and says, like, the Directory, the French government, the 5 people that rule the Republic at this point, they agreed to reverse all the policies that had angered Americans, impressing of seamen, like stopping of shipping, all the kinds of things. And he thought that all Americans would celebrate that, but the Federalists were outraged by it and ended up passing a Logan Act that I'll talk about in a moment. But George Washington took notes of his meeting with George Logan in November when he came back, and let me read this quote to you, because Logan was telling about all the things he accomplished, and Washington said, "This drew my attention more pointedly to what he was saying, and induced me to remark that there was something very singular in this, that," and he underlined it, "that he, who could only be viewed as a private character, unarmed with proper powers, and presumptively unknown in France, should suppose he could affect what these gentlemen of the first respectability in our country, he means the ministers sent by the administration, what they specially charged under the authority of our government were unable to do. And so Washington is like, who is this private person who went over to France and presumed to negotiate directly with the French government? And how did he succeed in doing that when the ambassadors that we sent with the full authority and credibility of our government were rejected and had no audience? And so his sense of kind of outrage was one shared by many Federalists. And so they passed an act in 1799 that to this day is called the Logan Act. And I was thinking about the news the other day about Jesse Jackson's passing. He was someone always accused of violating the Logan Act. The Logan Act says that private citizens are not allowed to negotiate or petition foreign governments on any matters of policy. As private citizens, if they've got a dispute with their business with a foreign government, they can do that, but they can't do anything related to policy. Although it has this lovely innocuous title, an act for punishment of certain crimes therein specified. So, but anyway, it's called the Logan Act. So it makes this criminally, it makes it a federal crime to do this. They don't actually charge Logan because they can't do it after the fact. But I think this act is really interesting. The reason why I'm kind of drawn to this affair with Logan is because it cuts at the heart of something that's fascinating about politics during the Revolutionary era, which is how do you do politics outside of government? Because this was something that the founding generation, the revolutionary generation, had to deal with. They had to create committees of correspondence, Sons of Liberty, all these what we might call extra-legal institutions that had to organize people, mobilize people, coordinate political action, but nothing with the character of government, as George Washington would say. And that is actually a surprisingly hard thing to do. But it's something that I think really kind of helps distinguish the age of revolution from previous moments. There's always been tax revolts, there's always been people who have been upset with the government and stuff like that. To me, what's generally revolutionary about the age of revolution is the fact that it's actually people connecting, mobilizing people. Like, it's not just an age of dissent and conflict, but yeah, being able to, especially when we're thinking about these scientists, who can reach out to distant communities? Who can make sure that people in South Carolina and Virginia can cooperate, or people in Paris and Philadelphia? Like, who has the ties to reach out and mobilize large coalitions that span geography or social and religious things? And that's why I'm very interested in the scientists, because I think this theme of the networks and the way that scientists build relationships in the scientific world that can then be mobilized, as Adams was appalled by, could be mobilized for political reasons later on. And let me just show you a cartoon. One of the things that's happening in the 1790s that is helping to fuel this concern is the rise of Democratic Republican clubs in Philadelphia that are modeled by clubs similarly in London, Paris. Everywhere in the 1790s, people thought that citizens should get together and read material, pass resolutions, basically be really involved as active citizens. Not so much just voting. And kind of, so there's a kind of a passive model of citizenship where you vote and you monitor the government, almost spectatorial. This is a much more active view of government, that these clubs should be involved. And so this is obviously not an attractive cartoon portraying the group. And in fact, we have what the scene is kind of quite a motley group, including they make sure to put an African-American figure in here to kind of suggest the dangers of how inclusive these spheres taking place in coffee houses and taverns are. We've got Thomas Jefferson standing on a table. I'll point your attention and mention to those that might not see it, but this is David Rittenhouse, the astronomer and the president of the American Philosophical Society, looking through his telescope, saying, "Oh, for such a government as they have on Saturn." And people would have understood what that meant, because one of the things that scientists shine a light on that a little bit. And he's also looking at the list that all these Democratic clubs passed resolutions of their principles. But, they would have understood this theme that scientists believe deeply in a natural order, that nature was meant to be kind of harmonious and balancing and things like that, and that they thought the political world should be similar, that it was a benevolent order. Let people be free. This is the era that gives us Adam Smith's invisible hand, and there's arguments about this in politics. Even someone like James Madison's famous Federalist number 10 is, How do you deal with factions? You don't legislate out political passion. You can't do that. You have to design a republic in a particular way so that all the factions play off each other, and then it will balance. So they believe in a kind of natural harmony and order that is better than the traditional authorities and prescriptions. And so that kind of carries over into their religious views. That's why many of these tend to be kind of dissenting Protestants that are opposed to kind of ritual and structure of the church, and it carries over into the politics as well. And in fact, just to give you an example, George Logan, who was one of the architects of these Democratic Republican clubs, and I'll talk about his work in organizing people. Right before he left, like literally 5 days, I think, before he left on his trip, he gave this speech to the Tammany Society. So this is the kind of radical Irish immigrants. Like basically, every time there's a failed revolution in Europe, all the radicals come to Philadelphia. So this is what's angering in some ways, or keeping John Adams up at night. But anyway, so he goes to the Tammany Society, gives this address, and it's filled with these sentiments about how all of us need to think critically for ourselves. We need to study the natural world, and when you do study, you see God's plan for kind of self-directed order, and that should be applied to religion and politics as well. So one of the things, so there's this George Logan affair that I think has been not understood entirely properly, because Logan was a Quaker, and so there's been an attempt to kind of, I think, romanticize him and say, oh, he was a Quaker opposed to war, so that's why he went off on this interesting peace mission. And that's totally true, but I think the scientific angle and connections is what people at the time read it through. Very few people commented on it being Quaker or anything like that. They read it as Logan was on a mission sent by Priestley, sent by Day, sent by Jefferson, things like that. And one of the things I find interesting is it's not the only, like there's multiple episodes and controversies about these same things that all revolve around science, which I think has been missed a little bit, and is what I'm interested in exploring. So there was this controversy just 6 years earlier that I think really set the tone for America. And I'll try to describe this kind of briefly or quickly. So Britain in 1790 has not yet gone to war with France, but the establishment is deeply concerned with the radicalizing nature of the French Revolution as it becomes more violent, overthrowing the king, setting up the metric system, and all these things. And there's this moment where two British individuals go over to France on a kind of diplomatic mission to set up ties between radical clubs and scientific clubs in England and the ones in France. And the two figures are, the pictures up here, James Watt Jr. So he is the son of the famed steam engine inventor and engineer. And then Thomas Cooper, who will end up emigrating to America with Joseph Priestley. I mentioned he was like jailed under the Sedition Acts, ends up being like this really important radical. And this is a cartoon picture of Joseph Priestley Jr. going to France. There were just a whole group of British scientists that were going over to France because they had the connections to be able to get themselves taken seriously in the French establishment. Because one of the things that happens with the French Revolution is a lot of the important scientists, and especially those chemists I was mentioning, they end up being elevated to positions of power. So the president of the French Assembly that's portrayed here, Neufchâtel, is a French prominent scientist, and he's dangling Priestley, who has an electric rod. And people at the time would have understood all the kind of symbolism of this, but it was seen as, I think there's something important about this image of politicians dangling these scientists like as potential connections between these worlds. Here's let me just show a couple more cartoons. This one is of Joseph Priestley, and he's got his Royal Electrical Fluid and phosphorus. I haven't mentioned, but Priestley was this really important chemist who is often considered as one of the discoverers of oxygen. He isolated 10 different gases. Kind of the father of pneumatic chemistry, also involved in electricity. And here he's sitting with Tom Paine, who I was mentioning earlier. These two are seen as kind of cavorting in a dark, did you have a question? Or no, okay. Cavorting in kind of dark coffee houses and places, trying to foment revolution and use their kind of connections. And then there's a lot of cartoons, especially, emphasizing Edmund Burke, who becomes kind of like the John Adams figure over in England. Edmund Burke starts to say, the French Revolution seems reasonable. It's about rights and liberty, and it's about overthrowing tyranny and monarchy. So British people might be inclined to support it, but actually it has deeper, more radical roots. It's driven by scientists and ideologues who want to get rid of all tradition and want to replace everything with only what can stand the acid test of reason. So we're going to get rid of all weights and measures and make this universal kind of metric system. We're going to get rid of church. We're going to get rid of everything and kind of strip away back to the beginnings. And Burke is like, that's a terrible, dangerous, kind of self-devouring kind of idea. And so he starts arguing, and some of these images here, like this one with Burke's spectacles, he's like, don't be misled by what seems like ordinary British talk about rights. And the British had spent a century denouncing the French as monarchists, as like kind of superstitious people who were under the throw of the tyranny of church and state. And he's like, so again, the French Revolution might seem on the surface something that you'd want to support, but look deeper at who are the secret forces that are organizing this. And we have Priestley up at the top on his little kind of demon from hell with a lance aiming for the bishop's mitre and stuff like that. But there's just this sense that these scientists are kind of a secret cabal organizing all of this. This is Richard Price, the famous Welsh scientist and mathematician. Or this one up here shows the magic lantern slide that shows this secret group who, conveniently, we can't see their faces, but it's a kind of, this is also the age the Illuminati conspiracy comes along. If you've ever heard the term the Illuminati, that there's a secret order of scientists and radicals that are pulling all the strings around Europe and organizing. So that's actually flowing during the same time period. Or maybe one of my personal favorite cartoons. This one is of the Earl of Stanhope, who was a famous physicist and inventor. And Earl, this is him as a Republican gunboat that is able to move against wind and tide, with tide being the current of public opinion and wind being loyalty. But this idea, playing on him as an inventor, but there's all these kinds of rich cartoons linking science, religious radicalism, political radicalism in the French Revolution. Which is why, coming back to those figures, why when James Watt Jr. and Thomas Cooper go to France in the spring of 1792, it becomes such a big deal because the French embrace them. They put them on a public festival where they carry the English flag to help show that they're lining up with the French government. They publish all the different speeches and testimonies, so they treat them, maybe, you know, for those of you that were around in the Cold War might remember these moments where dissidents or emigres or people fleeing Russia or different things were used for cultural capital to kind of show that really the Russians don't like their regime and they're pro-American, or when Americans would defect and go over to Russia, it was made a big deal, you know. So that's what's happening a lot with this world of science and politics. And it is fused with religion in England in a way that's not always the case in America. So in England, if you're a dissenter, so that'd be Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Quakers, a whole list of people, you're not allowed to hold public office and not allowed to go to the universities, things like that. So you have a whole class of people. They tend to gravitate towards science, partly because they're not going to the universities for a classical education, so instead they're going into manufacturing and going to dissenting academies like the one that Priestley would teach at, where they're teaching modern math, modern science, modern languages. And the languages are important.
Michael, if you hold it too close to your mouth, it shuts off.
Okay, so just find the right distance, yeah.
Sorry.
So the languages are important too because it helps them connect to people in different countries. So most of these figures, Priestley speaks 7 languages. Most of them have languages, and part of being a scientist was corresponding to people in Switzerland and in France and in Holland and in Portugal and Spain. And in fact, Watt Jr., who was the one at the heart of this mission, it's not unimportant that he is the secretary of the Manchester Literary and Philosophical Society. The secretaries in these scientific clubs had to manage vast networks of correspondence and had to constantly write letters to different people and use their language skills. And what we'll see is, when you look at the 18th century, is that role of secretaries. They are the ones who know how to organize things. They know how to organize subscription campaigns to raise money. They know how to like make introductions, do letters of introductions. They know how to organize correspondence. So the first secretary of the Continental Congress and the person who would become secretary of the federal government and set up most of all the policy and all of the kind of infrastructure about how our government worked was Charles Thomson. And he had been secretary of the American Philosophical Society. And so you'll see this in these kind of roles. Benjamin Franklin had similar things. Like, it's a training in how to organize people, basically, to be the secretaries of these organizations. And while there were certainly religious groups and other places where you could learn how to network and how to correspond, I think science was unusual in providing this deep level of training and these deep international networks. And science was always seen as having a civic edge in the 18th century. It wasn't specialized professional science where you were a particular kind of pneumatic chemist. You were someone who was studying the natural world to provide useful knowledge that would improve all of society, to create better, if you were a chemist studying air, Joseph Priestley was interested in figuring out how to create better ventilation, how to put more oxygen into rooms. He's the inventor of, I don't know if what we think of this, but the inventor of carbonated beverage drinks. He figured out how to put carbon dioxide into drinks which he thought might fight scurvy or different things. But anyway, they were celebrated, scientists were celebrated as serving the public good. This was an age before patents, so they were producing useful knowledge that they thought would be beneficial to society. So it was seen as a form of public service, and it helps explain why it was kind of connected to radicalism. Thomas Cooper, I won't go into too many details, but he also fits a really interesting profile of this kind of blend of scientific networks, commercial networks, religious networks. So they go over to France, they have all these public celebrations, spectacles. They sign articles of agreement saying that the political clubs in France and in England and the scientific clubs in France and in England will work together. And that just drives Edmund Burke crazy. And conservatives. So they have a moment like John Adams in 1792, and there's a royal proclamation against seditious writings and correspondence that's created. Burke denounces these two in the House of Commons, and I really think what he loved is they just lined up perfectly for the kind of forces he wanted to put a face and name to, which is religious radicals, kind of political radicals that are Jacobins, and scientists coming from the Midlands, from this world where all of these forces were swirling. And so maybe a little bit like George Logan, they just kind of exemplified perfectly all the forces that Burke and conservatives thought were trying to tear apart the world and started anew, and that had all these interesting networks and connections, and therefore were much more dangerous than other types of individual radicals. So he helps spear through this royal proclamation, and I won't go into all the details, but England passes a series of acts for which the Americans model almost all theirs on. An Aliens Act, a Seditious Meetings Act, a Seditious Writings Act, my favorite, a Seditious Corresponding Act, the Corresponding Society Act. By 1800, you can't have a meeting of more than 50 people unless it's licensed by a justice of the peace, because they're really worried about people meeting together and doing these things. So in Britain, they kind of set a pattern that how do we respond to political radicalism? We understand that it's connected in these networks of association that flourish in the world of science and the Enlightenment. And then this is a very long quote, so I won't go through all of it, but Thomas Cooper writes a reply, which is seen as quite scandalous, and he actually has to leave England. It's part of the reason why he comes to America, because he's basically told, like, you should leave or we're gonna indict you under seditious material. But what I find really interesting is the pamphlet goes in long detail about saying that what we're doing in politics, organizing societies to communicate, to correspond, to collect information, it's exactly what we were trained to do in science. And this quote kind of says, like, what's wrong with the Royal Society and the Academy of Science in France corresponding about chemistry? They're both trying to improve useful natural knowledge. We're trying to do the exact same thing in politics. We're trying to improve political knowledge. We're doing political science here, people, and we're going to use the same tools that we used in science with the same legitimacy that we'll do in politics. And I now see newspaper coverage a lot different, because people always talk about political knowledge, and they use all these phrases that I thought were just kind of old-time phrases, but they're not. They're like specifically an attempt to link the new political movements to the scientific movements, this kind of theme about knowledge. Or they would talk about the science of politics, and so okay, so that, I think, story and that example that was going on in England is really important to understanding why Americans react in kind of similar ways. to this example of George Logan. I'll just give a kind of super brief biography. I mentioned he's kind of considered a disciple of Ben Franklin. He grew up in an important family. The Logans were the secretaries of William Penn, so they were kind of elites. His grandfather, James Logan, had corresponded with Isaac Newton and was in fact the first colonist to be admitted to the Royal Society, which is England's premier scientific institution. His father had been very interested in agronomy and science, and so when George Logan was young, they sent him to Edinburgh, and they used family connections to decide what was the best place to get him trained. And Edinburgh, in the late 18th century, is the home of William Cullen, Black, all these famous chemists, and also especially famous doctors and surgeons and medical professionals. And so he gets kind of a world-class education at Edinburgh. Just as importantly, we see him getting involved in student clubs and scientific organizations. He becomes the secretary of some of these. I forgot to mention that he actually is the corresponding secretary for the Democratic Republican Societies. So when they set up and they're like, we need to know how to organize and coordinate all our efforts and write to other clubs, they're like, George Logan's the guy to do that. He knows how, he's got the connections, the language skills. And while he's over in England, he meets Ben Franklin, and Franklin takes him under his wing, and so he spends 2 or 3 years at Passy in France, where Franklin has his kind of home base, and Franklin kind of convinces him of this model of science and civic service, public service. He comes back to America, and his big passion was agronomic science, like studying agriculture. And interestingly, like for the themes of today, he sets up some standard clubs, but then he decides that he wants to have like a federated club model in America where every county will have local clubs. And I won't exactly read the quote for sake of time, but he's really interested in, so he doesn't want just gentlemen meeting in the Capitol and like looking at models of plows. He wants every community to have its local club so that ordinary people know how to read, debate, exchange ideas, write letters, and he's very explicit that this is political too. In a republic, people need to know how to work with each other. Any of you ever worked in nonprofits, you know it's an interesting set of skills you have to learn. How to work with people, how to mobilize them, how to keep them focused and on task. Doing things that they're not being paid for, that are taking away from their leisure time, right? So he's like, in a republic, people need to have that. And so he sets up this whole network of county agricultural clubs and societies, which he'll draw on later. But so he's an eminent networker. I mean, is one way to kind of think about these themes. His home at Stenton that he inherited from his grandfather becomes, I think, one of the more interesting spots in America in the 1790s in terms of politics. If you go there, Thomas Jefferson's there, Thomas Paine's there, Benjamin Rush, like a whole list, Lafayette, like all these French radicals, like it becomes the place where people come to meet and discuss science and politics. Ben Franklin's there, whatnot, and he's gonna develop a whole web of relationships that are gonna make his mission possible. If we go back to that quote from George Washington, who is this guy who thinks he can open doors in France, that he can convince the French government to change its mind when our ministers can't even get a hearing? I think there's an interesting reason why he could do that, because I think he's one of the most connected scientists and politicians of the 18th century, George Logan, even though he's not remembered today because his name isn't attached to a particular law. He didn't publish a lot of scientific papers, but he focused on the infrastructure of science. How do you organize? How do you network? How do you create those things? And so I've been exploring, I mentioned there were his travels were documented by spies. And so one of the things I've been looking at is that question that George Washington asked, like how did Logan get into France? How did he meet with the Directory? How did he convince them to change their mind? And why did they change their mind? And this is like I feel like this is a murder board or something. My wife could appreciate this, like I need red string or something. But I'm trying to piece together his networks carefully by like starting when he arrives in Hamburg, which is like the edge of the French Empire at that moment, and the French are like, you can't come in here, we don't want any Americans. And he has to get Lafayette to persuade the local French consul to give him a passport. And how does he get Lafayette to do that? I mean, he knows Lafayette, but he also knows the DuPonts and knows these different people. He comes armed with, bristling with letters of introduction, and the spies are constantly trying to get into his attaché to see what letters he has from a day, from Jefferson, from the president of the Pennsylvania, the House, Thomas McKean. He's got all of these kinds of letters, but There's a French and American network in France of people, like James Monroe is really interesting in this respect. The two of them write back and forth a lot about science. And in fact, Monroe had been the official the American minister in France in the Washington administration, but he was forced to resign in 1795 because letters were intercepted between him and George Logan, in which James Monroe was like, the administration is becoming way too English. Like, I see Jay over there trying to set up this treaty. We're getting really bad press. The press is saying terrible things about the French Revolution. George Logan, will you work with me to put all these new articles in newspapers in America that will show France in its true light? And then those letters were intercepted. So anyway, George Logan's already on the radar of the Federalist administration as someone who's secretly writing to all these people. And as I mentioned with the example of the Western territories, there were legitimate schemes going on. Robert Fulton was involved in some kind of efforts to conquer the Western territories and liberate them with a Colonel Clark out in Kentucky. So that it's not just Federalist fear or imagination. There literally are all kinds of like plots going on. But anyway, so there's a whole network with Robert Fulton, Joel Barlow, who's this American entrepreneur and kind of famous poet who wrote the Columbiad. But in Paris, there's a whole group of Americans that have ties to Talleyrand, the French minister, that help open doors. I was mentioning the DuPonts. There's a whole French scientific circle with Adet and the DuPonts that are really key to helping him get access. Merlin is the key figure in the French directory. And then there's a whole world that I'm right now trying to piece together. My Dutch is not good, so I'm having troubles here. But this figure, Schimmelpenninck, he is the Dutch ambassador in Paris, and he is really tight with Merlin. And he seems to be the person who, when he says something's gonna happen, it happens. And he gets Logan into the directory. He seems to convince Merlin to change his mind. And Schimmelpenninck is involved in Dutch scientific societies, and he seems to have connections to some of the figures like Jan Iggenhaus, who is a scientist that spent time in Passy with Franklin and with Logan, or Vanderkemp. Adrian Vanderkemp is a Dutch patriot scientist who moves to America. But what I find most interesting is all of these figures are involved in a scheme at that moment called the Holland Land Company, which is going to be the biggest purchase in US history of land by a private entity. And it's a giant Dutch conglomerate of people buying land in Western New York because they think there's going to be a sugar maple boom. Like there's a belief, and it's part of this science and politics, there's a belief that if you really want to end slavery, you can argue against it on moral grounds, things like that, but the most efficient way would be to create an alternative to cane sugar. And how could you do that? Well, if you could tap maple trees and figure out scientific ways to boil maple with vacuum mechanisms and stuff like that. So the American Philosophical Society is going through like a maple sugar rush at this moment. Franklin, Jefferson, all these people in the 1790s are really interested in maple sugar as a proving ground of how science is going to give us new knowledge, and it's going to unlock new kinds of politics, new kinds of economics, new kinds of liberatory worlds here. And all of these figures over on this side, including Merlin himself, seem to be deeply invested, and I should mention Joel Barlow too, deeply invested in these lands out west. And it seems that Logan, who's also involved in that, taps into it. But again, it's one thing to say there's suggestive, it's another thing to prove it by finding the letters and things, that open it. But anyway, so that's what I'm kind of working on now, is piecing together these networks. And once you follow one string, you see that they've got other projects kind of going on. So that's what I am working on. And I will end with this last slide, which is a famous cartoon of the French Revolution. The title, I cut it off, I realize, but it's All Fall Down. The electricity generated by the Declaration of Rights of Man during the French Revolution overturns the thrones and monarchs of Europe in 1793. And so it shows someone using one of these electrostatic generators. And there was the quote that I had on the first slide from Joseph Priestley that said, if there's anything wrong with the English hierarchy, it has as much to fear from an air pump or an electrical generator as it does kind of from politics. So science is, so this becomes a prominent kind of theme about the way in which science has a political radicalism to it, and that people read it. But what I like about this particular print, and again, it's kind of a famous one, is the way in which, I like the metaphor, which is electricity only moves on a well-established circuit. or network, right? Electricity can't jump, it can't move anywhere. It can only move where you've created those links together. And I think that's, to me, there's many ways you can kind of think about science and politics, but to me, that's what I'm most interested in. What are the networks that humans create that allow them to move ideas and people and texts and create schemes, whether that's for maple sugar or for, overturning, for helping to sway an election in 1800, which is what they were focused especially on, getting Jefferson elected, things like that. So that is kind of what I am most interested in, but I'm curious to hear what you're interested in. So I'll stop here and we'll have question time. So thank you very much. Okay.
It's over here. Any questions? Okay, good.
Really fascinating talk about this connection between politics and science. Something I've never really heard about before. It's great. Is this where we get the term political science?
So there are people in the 18th century arguing that, right? Yeah, saying that we need a science of politics. And there's been studies about that idea. Like there's, I remember the name of, I.B. Cohen was a biographer of Franklin and Franklin's science, and he wrote a book called Science of the Founding Fathers. And he was particularly interested in this notion that we can create an empirical science of politics. Stuff like that. So that is definitely, that's where this period comes from. And I'm interested in how what I didn't know was that the political clubs thought of themselves as doing the same thing. These Democratic Republican clubs said, we're doing science, we're collecting information, we're coordinating it, we're moving and circulating it, we're creating projects to use that knowledge to make useful changes. And they're like, that's what scientists have been doing in all of these societies before. Like the American Philosophical Society literally was the society to promote useful knowledge. And so that was new to me, but you're right, yes, that definitely is that link. Yep, the science of politics. And then what happens like after this period, the reason why this is the end of my book is that by 1800, a lot of these clubs and scientific societies is like, there's too high of a political cost. We're having crackdowns, like the Crown removes the president of the Royal Society, John Pringle, for being too political. Thomas Cooper is denied membership. Joseph Priestley, there's debate, but he's probably kicked out of the Royal Society. He's certainly persona non grata. So all these societies are like, maybe science should be kind of professional, like non-political. So there's this movement in the 19th century to make science professional and non-political. But yeah.
Just to comment on this previous question, I heard from people in the political science department at Grinnell College that there were important contributions from Jesse Macy to the development of this term, political science. You know about that?
So Jesse Macy, who grew up in this area, went to Grinnell College, he first starts teaching in the academy there and things like that, and then ends up creating a department of political science. He is important to creating a national association in America, making it a kind of a discipline. And Macy himself, in his letters, his autobiography, talked about how reading Darwin was the key moment for him. And he thought that, yes, we can create the way that Darwin carefully, empirically observed, build models. And so he's another person. So I think like if you're looking for a moment when it becomes a discipline, like when do you find a political science department? It's in that like kind of late 19th century mode. When you start having people talk about that we could have a science of politics, which is a famous essay by David Hume and things like that, it's a little bit earlier. But yeah, thanks for bringing that in there about Jesse Macy. Yeah, so Grinnell has that part of that story, definitely. I can't remember if he's the first president of the American Political Science Association, or he has some important role there.
I really had never been aware of the clubs that you were talking about, and I'm just curious. Did these clubs, first of all, were they considered a threat politically, and did they consider themselves to be more than just influential in terms of politics? And then the other thing is, I'm just curious, is it possible that they're the precursors of things like the Department of Agriculture and Department of Commerce and that sort of thing?
Yeah, good question. So I was going to look to see if I could find quickly a quote from John Adams, because he always captures these things well. It might not be readily, but I was going to say Adams, so these clubs were a big feature of the political landscape of the 18th century, or maybe I should just say the civic landscape, right? So they are like an important part, and conservatives feel that they're becoming, there's this quote from John Adams that it's like a society being torn apart from within. You can't have these self-created societies doing stuff and then the government also trying to do things. So there's this real tension in this particular way. But I'm going to be honest, I kind of blanked for a second. Could you just repeat your question again? Because
No.
I'm so sorry.
No, I'm just curious.
Do they think of themselves the same way in the clubs?
I'm just curious whether or not.
Political work here, right? Sorry.
Sure.
That's what I meant.
No, I'm just curious. First of all, I was not aware of these clubs. I'm amazed that I had not heard of this before. But I'm just wondering, first of all, that people in positions of power, governmental power, consider them to be threats. And did they actually have, I mean, were they really threats? Did they actually have influence on people in power? And then, yeah.
That's why I got spun off on this quote from Adams, which I think captures so well his view that they were seen as threats. And they were seen as novel. And it was awkward because Americans had created the Sons of Liberty. They had done all of this they created boycotts. And even during the Revolution, this was a debated issue, especially among loyalists. They're like, who are you to create boycott lists? Who are you private citizens to say what, because it seemed like a combination in an age when unions were illegal and things like that. So a bunch of citizens are going to agree not to buy things from loyal subjects of His Majesty, and you're going to coerce other people, either physically or morally, to join your boycott. Who gave you that right to do that? You have no authority. So anyway, this debate about what ordinary citizens can do when they organize is pressing all throughout the 1770s and 1790s. Today we're just used to nonprofits and civic groups and organizations organizing things all the time, and we don't see it as a threat to the government. Sometimes we do, but yeah. But at this time period, it was definitely seen as more novel and more debated. So there were government organizations. They never went as far as the English in actually clamping down. America does not have a Seditious Meetings Act. It doesn't require a license. So the Federalists and others never really encoded in law some of the most draconian things, but they were very concerned about it. And we do have lots of evidence of the clubs being very effective at organizing politics, like political boycotts, and organizing different activities. I'd say this Logan affair is a good example. The Federalists what just happened? Some guy went off to France and somehow just redid the whole Atlantic balance of power and stuff like that. So there are definitely examples of clubs being effective at what they did. And a lot of them were required because the government did so little. So how did we have hospitals in the 18th century? Because civic clubs were formed to create hospitals and things like that. Street lighting in Philadelphia was created by a civic club. With most of the things that we think a state should do were not done by states, and so these civic clubs could do that. There's also a bit of hyperbole too, that I'm not saying that every group of 9 people that meet at a tavern can change the world or something like that. There were certainly ones that probably were seen as scary or radical, but weren't doing anything particularly important. But yeah, the clubs are a big part of the 18th century life. Samuel Johnson once said in London, when you arrive, you ask not where a gentleman lives, but what coffee house he attends. And these coffee houses were interesting spaces because you could pay. They were sober spaces, so not serving alcohol, not engaging in rowdy culture, but they had lots of different rooms where you could meet with a club to talk or go over these letters. Some of them offered libraries. Some of them, like Lloyd's Coffee House, became Lloyd's Insurance Firm because that's where all the actuaries met and ship insurers. So there is a wonderful world that we don't But, it doesn't make it in textbooks, because it's not as, when you're looking at if you have to read about the 18th century in 12 pages, you're gonna focus on the creation of the Constitution and these elections and things like that. But if we were all to go back in the 18th century, this might be something that strikes us as quite novel and interesting. That was a little long side. Do you want to use my microphone here?
I'm interested in the transportation
Okay.
and the time involved in moving from one country to another.
Yeah.
What was it? Was it mostly ships, or were there airplanes involved, or what?
Yeah, no, yeah. So there is flight in balloons, and that's something that people are very excited about, balloon flight, but it's not commercial at this time where people are moving stuff. But so they're moving by ship, and so Priestley, it takes him, I think, 3.5 weeks to travel to the colonies. Benjamin Franklin, this is important, Benjamin Franklin is the postmaster of North America. So if you're thinking about networks and letter writing and who can organize things, like it's not an accident that Franklin is both postmaster and kind of scientist in chief and things like that. So, letters can move a little faster than we sometimes think. There's a penny post in London, so you can get mail the same day that you mail it in London and stuff like that. Joseph Priestley, when he moved to America, he moves to Northumberland, Pennsylvania, and he has a dream of it being like a colony where all his fellow scientists are going to come reside. Because there were a series of riots that are called the Priestley riots in Birmingham, where conservatives sacked and burned his house, and sacked and burned the house of other members of this kind of scientific community and the dissenting chapels there. And so he imagined a whole group of people were going to come over. They were going to form like the Oneida colony, like this, or the Manas, it's going to be the settlement of philosophical radicals there. Only a handful come. But when he's out in Northumberland, he complains about how long it takes. He's like, it's like 13 weeks since I've sent a letter to England and stuff. So things move a bit slow. And it's very tortuous to go on ships. So people don't usually move around this much. The scientists seem like, I think of the slogan on Southwest, like you're free to move around the cabin. Like there's a sense in which these scientists are free to move around the Atlantic, and they're constantly, people like Priestley, Franklin, Logan traveling a lot, yeah. But it's hard at that time.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm just curious. The house that you showed, I can't remember the name of the man.
Oh, Stenton, yeah.
Yeah, that one.
Mhm.
But I noticed inside, if you look, there are women sitting there. That's the only women I've seen in anything that you've shown on slides.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that?
So I'm glad you mentioned it. This is something that I'm working on now increasingly. Like they don't appear a lot in the letters, so women do. But George Logan's wife, Deborah, ends up outliving him, and she seems to be a very important political actor. And there's some letters that I'm hoping to go look at in Pennsylvania from her. But anyway, what I would just say is like wives and daughters play really important roles in these scientific networks. They almost always, if you look at like Lavoisier or Priestley or Logan, they have wives and daughters that are helping them do that kind of work and that are providing their own social connections and networks. And she seems to be really important. Like this was a kind of attempt to create like a French salon culture in which women played women did not tend to go to coffee houses. Like London science tended to be a little bit more male-oriented because of cultural patterns, whereas in France, when Franklin and when Logan was there, you usually had a woman like presiding over the conversation to make sure that it was equal. Like one man might dominate the conversation, so having a woman, creating a space with women helped create a new, more egalitarian culture that could flow ideas and people wouldn't dominate. So yeah, they definitely, and we know that women played a big role this way in politics in the 1790s. In fact, there's a great book called like Feisty Women and Frenchified Dames or something like that is the title. It's from a letter quote about the 1790s that women were creating clubs in Philadelphia and then later in Washington, D.C. to organize politics. So I'm glad you bring that up and saw that in the picture here. They're in the story, but I haven't done, just embarrassing, I haven't done the work to like reconstruct their world, and yeah, they're going to need to be in there. Can't organize society with only half the people, right? So yeah, so they were definitely involved, and in politics, and both in America and Britain. There was that movie about the Duchess. Georgiana or whatever, who was famous for going to the hustings and wearing, like the 1780s and 90s see women get involved as politics becomes more ritual, parade-oriented, democratic, open to people. Women are quite active. One thing that's very little known is that women actually voted in some of the early federal elections in particular states if they met property qualifications, because they hadn't actually written gender into the rules. So like places like New Jersey, women were like, I meet the property qualification, can I vote? And they're like, sure, you can vote, yeah. And then they go back 10 or 15 years and change that. So anyway, like, I bring that example up just by saying we shouldn't impose our, and you worked with it, but I should, as a historian, be careful not to impose my gender views on the past, to just assume women wouldn't have done X because I don't think women probably voted, or women wouldn't have been involved in science because I don't see a lot of women in the publishings of the American Academy of Science. Like, when you actually start to trace human networks, the story usually gets richer and more interesting. A lot of invisible figures start to pop up, so yeah. Which is also why images can be very helpful, right? Like, they don't always weed out, they don't decide who's important or not. Sometimes artists do, but, you know, cartoons, things like that, so.
I often think about it, to this point, when you were talking about like organizing of people and then calling out nonprofits and you know how those are organized today, and I often see right today like it's pretty women. A majority of women work in those networks in nonprofits and in kind of this planning and organizing like I do. And it was actually fascinating to me to just think about this has existed for a long time, and just to call it out how it was a while ago and just see that connection today. But I would say, yeah, today, especially in the nonprofit world, it's a lot. A lot of women are, leading that industry now, and but anyway.
And in our world, people think that there's an important connection to democracy or democratic culture, that the more society builds, the term like civic capital or social capital, the more you have people that are organizing to form library organizations, supporting public hospitals, that those teach skills that become important in a democratic society. It's not just about elections, but it's about our collective ability to debate, organize, things like that. And it's very vibrant today.
Yeah, good point. This was amazing. Thank you so much. Can you please help me thank Professor Michael? I do have to apologize, my colleagues, because this side of the room has the softer chairs. We call this the VIP lounge. I do have to apologize to the VIP lounge. I think there was some good gaming that happened here last night on this TV, because there are so many things unplugged behind here. As you go by, just take a look and you'll know why Bob and I tried to plug a couple things in and we're like, we're gonna be done. So I apologize that this wasn't working. We'll get that working and take a picture so I know how to get all the plugs back in. Because students should use this. This is a residence hall, so from time to time, things like this will happen. So my apologies to the VIP lounge. So I wanted to bring up a couple things for everyone, some reminders. This coming Friday, here in this space at 9 o'clock, Coffee with the College, the speaker is going to be John Andelson, and he is going to talk about the 7 deadly sins of industrial agriculture. So I invite you 9 o'clock this Friday to come and listen to Professor Andelson talk about that. I think that'll be very fascinating. And then a week from today, for the bucket courses, we are going to hear an update from Monica St. Angelo, who is the executive director of the Grinnell Area Arts Council, and learn about what they're doing. I feel like they're always moving a wall, which they should. I mean, they're creating art, and I feel like they're always building a new space. So I'm excited to hear from her and hear what's happening at the Grinnell Area Arts Council and how we can get more engaged and involved with that group as well. So thank you everyone for coming. Have a wonderful rest of the week. I hope the weather holds, but enjoy, and I'll see you on Friday. Take care. Thank you.